Hello, hello. I am Christiana Limniatis, Director of Preservation Services for Preservation Buffalo Niagara. Thank you for joining us tonight for Preservation 101. I'm going to go over just kind of the big picture, nuts and bolts of how preservation works and the different key policies and terminologies that we encounter while doing preservation. It's going to be a lot of information I'm going to throw at you tonight. So I do hope that you will have some questions or comments. If you have a question that you definitely want me to answer at some point during the evening, please make sure to use that Q&A function. It's a lot easier for us to keep track of the questions and stuff. There's also that chat button that you can definitely use if you want to put in some comments or comments on anything that I talk about, but definitely if you have a question you want me to answer, put in that Q&A. And at least for right now, I have my coworker Tia with us to help us manage the chat and Q&A box. And other than that, I think that's all my housekeeping things. Thank you for joining us tonight. Let's just get into it. Before we get into the Preservation 101 type stuff, for those of you who are new to us, we are Preservation Buffalo Niagara, PBN for short. Our mission is to identify, protect, promote our unique architecture and historic legacy, and to connect people to the places they love in Western New York. While our name does have Buffalo and Niagara in it, we actually provide services to the 5 westernmost counties of New York State. So no matter where you are, Niagara County, Erie County, Chautauqua, Cattaraugus, and Allegheny, we are here to provide advocacy and technical services to you. When we talk about that work, advocacy, technical services, it kind of divides into these 4 main categories: education, technical service, advocacy, and community development. Tonight is a great example of education, obviously, to give you the information and terminology you need to better understand our historic built environment so that you are then better prepared to protect and preserve our historic built environment. Technical service, again, we are here to answer questions that you have, whether it's something, materiality type question, you're fixing up a building, you own a property, you're not sure how to deal with a particular aspect of it, we can give you guidance and assistance on that, as well as preservation planning issues. You're trying to landmark something, designate something to the National Register, do your historic tax credit application. We can answer questions for you as well. And then advocacy and community development, they're basically the same thing. Advocacy is where we are taking the lead in that advocacy effort. We are trying to and have submitted a local nomination. We've submitted a National Register nomination. We're trying to stop a demolition from happening. But community development is where we come into your community and give you those tools and knowledge you need to be in charge of that preservation project. Again, we have a 5-county service area. And even before the pandemic, it was incredibly difficult for us to be at every meeting and in front of every wrecking ball. So making sure that you have the knowledge and tools that you need to be in charge of your preservation destiny is incredibly important to us. And I do want to just mention the reason that we are having Preservation 101 tonight, the first week of May, is because it is Preservation Month. Here's just some of my favorite little graphics from a couple of organizations across the country and the National Trust Foundation. So I did just want to make sure that you guys were all aware it is Preservation Month. Preservation Month started out actually as National Preservation Week in 1973. It was the first week of May. And it coincided, and the reason that was chosen was because it coincided with the National Trust for Historic Preservation's annual awards luncheon, which was only in its 3rd year. So it had just started giving out awards for preservation projects. And then by 2005 is when the National Trust expanded their celebrations to be the whole month of May and not just the first week. I also wanted to just share this quote that was from the actual proclamation signed by President Nixon back in 1975, making that first week of May National Historic Preservation Week. As the pace of change accelerates in the world around us, Americans more than ever need a lively awareness of our roots and origin in the past, on which to base our sense of identity in the present and our directions for the future. And I think that's a really great quote, explaining, why we do this preservation. It's not just about understanding our history and celebrating it. It's about using that to help define our sense of identity, to figure out our present so that we can then properly plan for our future. All right, So let us get into tonight's agenda. First, I'm going to go through a bunch of different terms and processes, different things, big picture kind of policies and stuff. Then we're going to describe the different types of designations that exist. And then we'll briefly go through some of those benefits for preservation. All right, so first, what is preservation, right? So, on the right-hand side, you can see this chart that explains the connection between preservation and sustainability. We're going to talk about that again more in-depthly at the end when we talk about the benefits of historic preservation. But essentially, preservation, there's a definition right there in the green box. But essentially, preservation is when a community comes together, whatever that community is. It could be a street, a neighborhood, a municipality, a region, a whole state, a whole nation coming together and identifying resources that they value, that they find significant, and then taking those steps, enacting those policies to ensure that that resource is preserved for future generations. That's essentially what we're trying to do with historic preservation. And this work to preserve historic buildings isn't new. We have been doing historic preservation under some terminology, under some capability since the beginning of our nation. Here's kind of a really brief, kind of the greatest hits of preservation facts and events, whether they happened on a local, state, or national level. The first major preservation effort being in 1816, when Philadelphia as a collectively kind of comes together and advocates to save Independence Hall from demolition. It was privately owned, and the owner, just didn't want to have the building anymore and wanted to tear it down. And the city was like, you know what, we just kind of did something important a couple of years in this building. Maybe you should hold on to it. And he did. And eventually the city of Philadelphia buys it. And eventually now it's one of our most prestigious and most important national historic landmarks. Certainly right now, the pandemic, I think it is closed to the public. But before the pandemic, it was one of our most visited national historic landmarks. Again, a whole bunch of great things happen on local, state, and national levels, all culminating in 1966 with the passage of the signing of the National Historic Preservation Act. And that's actually a film strip on the right-hand side of LBJ signing that in 1966. And as it says, it establishes the federal policy and framework for completing preservation. Next slide. In that legislation, in that act, it recognizes that it's necessary and appropriate for the federal government to accelerate its historic preservation programs and activities to give maximum encouragement to agencies and individuals to undertake preservation projects. This act happened a good number of years ago. But it is still very, very relevant and important to today. It's been renewed and expanded several times since 1966. These are the 5 key things that were established by that first passage. And again, in subsequent years where it's been expanded or reaffirmed, those things have been expanded, new programs have been added. But these are the key 5 programs that we get from the National Preservation Act. And we're just going to quickly go through those. They are the creating the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the establishment of the Section 106 process, the creation of the National Register of Historic Places, the creation of the National Historic Landmarks Program, and then the requirement for the creation of state historic preservation offices. Let's talk a little bit about those. So first is the creation of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. Now, for the most part, most normal average citizens, you're not really going to interact with the ACHP. It is, as you see on the screen, an independent federal agency, similar to the FCC or the FDA, that promotes the preservation, enhancement, and productive use of our nation's historic resources. And then they provide advice and counsel to the President and Congress for the creation of national historic preservation policy. You can see on the screen there, I kind of just outlined the key big things that they work on in addition to giving guidance to the president and Congress. So again, they are that resource for all other federal agencies and federal programs to consult when whatever they're doing or working on encounters historic resources. Again, they work on research and development of policies and advice to advance preservation policies for the nation. They do a variety of different communications and educational outreaches. And then they are the official government's kind of contact with the official designated national Native American tribes to ensure that preservation concerns in those communities are taken are considered. The other major thing that the ACHP is in charge of, and I think something that is the majority of their time, is operating the Section 106 program, which is that second thing that's created by the National Preservation Act. The Section 106 program is a required review process for all federally funded projects to identify and assess how their actions will affect historic resources. And again, this is administered by the ACHP. So this process, if your property has been designated as historic on the national level and been identified as eligible or listed on the National Register, if something that's being done with federal dollars or federal permits might impact those resources, or we're not sure if they're going to impact those resources, there has to be this review. And so you can see this kind of timeline that summarizes what that process is, that requires that federal agency to investigate, well, how is our project going to impact these resources? They'll also reach out and talk to designated representatives in that community to get their input on the project, and then they'll assess that effect, identify the historic resources that will be impacted, assess the effects, and then depending on what the situation is, come to a resolution with the community so that it's the best path forward for whatever that agency is trying to accomplish and the concerns of that resource. I think the biggest thing to understand about the Section 106 process is that the process and review is required, but it is not required that the federal agency change their plans so that they don't impact those resources. The ACHP produces a variety of different guides to help citizens understand that Section 106 process, because in many communities, especially those that do not have local landmarking ordinances or robust local level zoning and planning departments, especially for those more rural communities, the Section 106 process is their main and only way to try to impact and change certain projects to avoid that negative impact on their resources. So it's a great process to help kind of change federal actions so that they don't ruin our historic properties, but it's not a surefire way to eliminate those negative things from happening. The next thing created by the National Preservation Act is the National Register of Historic Places, the NRHP, or the NR, or just National Register. And it's very important. I will snicker if you say the National Registry. It is not called the National Registry. It is the National Register. It is a book of all of the places that we deem historic and worthy of preservation. So it's a register. And again, it is our federal government's official listing of historic resources deemed worthy of preservation for their historic significance. And that's bolded because it's important. We have had white colonizers here on this land for over 200 years, lots of places that have been deemed significant, as with all of those actions that have happened. Indigenous communities have been on this land for thousands of years. So every single part of this country has some sort of tie to some sort of historic event, some sort of significance to it. But this register is not just a listing of everything that's historic. It's a listing of those that are historic and are worthy of preservation, meaning that that resource has integrity, architectural integrity, to what makes it significance. So an easy example of that would be, you know, a house where a historic document was signed, right? I mean, if there was some sort of battle in the American Revolution or the Civil War, something like that, and there was a document that was signed, the house would need to retain architectural integrity, those elements, those character defining features from that time period that that event happened. If all of those elements of that building, all of those character defining features, all of that architectural integrity for that time period was gone, then there's nothing left of that building to preserve to illustrate that significance. Certainly that event still happened there and that place can still be significant because of that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's eligible for the National Register because of that significance. And that's something that's kind of difficult to understand sometimes, especially when you have resources that may have a high significance, but it's been so severely altered over the years that it's not visually, that visual connection to that significance is no longer there. Since its inception in the 1960s, well over 95,000 resources have been listed. I made this presentation a couple of years back and I haven't updated that number yet. We're well over 100,000 at this point. It's also important to understand that resources, which is the technical word that we use for things that we're designating, applies to individual buildings. It describes structures, it describes objects, it describes natural sites, but it also describes historic districts, right? So a historic district itself is a resource, and then it's filled with individual resources, more buildings or structures or objects. So even though, you know, that number of 95,000, that's just individual resources. And so then when you factor in all of the buildings in all the historic districts, then we're talking about a lot of resources that are listed on the National Register. And that's all I have to say about that. Sorry, I lost track. Oh, I will say that as of right now, Erie County, here in Western New York of our service area, Erie County is the county that has the most listed on the National Register. We're at out of probably around 300 at this point. Niagara County has over 90, Chautauqua over 46 resources listed, Cattaraugus over 35, and Allegheny is around 28 resources listed on the National Register. Again, as I said in the beginning, and for those that have just joined, if you have questions, by all means, add them into the Q&A or comments in that chat box. The next thing that was created by the National Historic Preservation Act was the National Historic Landmark Program, NHL, capital N, capital H, capital L, National Historic Landmark Program. This is a designation that is reserved for those resources that hold significant national significance. When we talk about things getting listed to the National Register, those elements, those resources could just have significance at a local level or a state level or national level. But NHLs are those resources that have national significance and have such important national significance that they changed the path of history for our nation. So we're talking about the things that are incredibly significant to all of us as Americans. For the most part, this process is directed by the National Park Service themselves, where normal, average people can nominate things to the National Register of Historic Places. National Historic Landmark process, while we can suggest NHLs to the National Park Service, it is very much a process that they are in charge of and they operate on their own. Today, there are around 26, probably around 2,700 NHLs in the United States currently. Here in Western New York, Erie County has 10. Niagara County has 3, and that's what the pictures are that you see here on the screen. Chautauqua has 2 National Historic Landmarks. The 3 that are in Niagara County that you see the photographs of, on the left-hand side, it's the Adams Power Plant Transformer House, where, for short, easy explanation, basically electricity was invented. Not really, but kind of. The center is the Colonial Niagara Historic District, Fort Niagara. And then on the right side is Niagara Falls, the Niagara Reservation. Again, as I said on the previous slide, we're nominating resources, and a resource can be something that's man-made, but also naturally made too. So natural landmarks and places, significant places, can be listed to the National Register and then elevated to NHL status as well. I do want to say that it's important to be mindful of the phrasing that you use. That National Historic Landmark is an actual designation that we just talked about. There is a local historic theater here in Buffalo, beautiful building that is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And on their marquee sign, one of their rolling signs that they show say that they're a National Historic Landmark. But that's not correct. They're not an actual NHL. They're just listed on the National Register. So again, making sure in our average day conversations, NHL is a very special, different designation than the National Register. And then that last element that was created by the National Preservation Act is the state historic preservation offices. So the National Preservation Act recognized that the federal government couldn't be the direct contact for all of these preservation projects and things that we wanted to do across the country. So to help facilitate this process, they required that every state had to create a state preservation office to be that on the ground first line contact to execute all of these programs. So for the most part, us, even me as a professional, but certainly you as an average citizen, we don't necessarily talk to the National Park Service. We talk to our state preservation offices and talk to them about getting things listed on the National Register or whatever the program is. And they're the ones that communicate up to the National Park Service. So state historic preservation offices, it goes by the acronym of SHPO, S-H-P-O, SHPO. Some people pronounce it a little bit differently. And again, I will definitely snicker at you. There's been some fun pronunciations I've heard of that over the years, but SHPO is definitely the good basic one to use. Again, it's going to be the key agency to administer the National Preservation Program on the state level. Each state organizes their SHPO office differently. And here in New York State, ours is part of the broader Department of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, or it's the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. And then within that big office, there is the Division for Historic Preservation, and that's technically our SHPO. And then SHPO is then further divided into these three main areas. There's the Technical Preservation Services, the Bureau of Historic Sites, and then the Community Preservation Services. You can see how the different tasks and units that are assigned to each of those. Technical Preservation Service, as you see, is mainly those archaeology units, the maintenance units, the security units that work on state-owned preservation sites or historic sites. The Bureau of Historic Sites is going to be all of those interpretive staff, so the museum staff, the conservators, curatorial units, exhibit creation, all of those in-house staff people. And then Community Preservation Services is the department that, if we are talking to SHPO about preservation work, this is the department we're most likely speaking to. This is where all of those community outreach about preservation programs happen. The survey and evaluation unit, the ones that help to research properties and do all of that documentation. The National Register unit, the department that's in charge of reviewing National Register nominations, and also all of the tax credit work is in that department as well. The other thing to keep in mind is that while the original Preservation Act from 1966 requires the state preservation offices, a later expansion of the Preservation Act in the 80s, I think it was 1984 or 86, expanded this by also requiring tribal historic preservation offices, or THPOs, T-H-P-O, THPOs. And so for every formally recognized tribe, indigenous tribe in America, all of those tribes, all of those nations need to have their own preservation office or officer identified so that they can do the same, be that same liaison and administrator just as the state preservation offices are. All right, so that is all of the key things of the National Preservation Act. Oh, and then just the last thing about the State Preservation Office, when we talk about doing preservation, just keeping in mind that there's about two spheres in which we do preservation work. There's the public sphere and then the private sphere. So the public sphere is going to be those national, those agencies and authorities that regulate historic preservation. So at the top, that's going to be the National Park Service. And then at the state level, our state preservation offices. And then on the local level, that's going to be that local preservation commission or board, if you so have one, enabled by a preservation ordinance. And on the private side, that's going to be all of the for-profit consultants and tradespeople that you can hire to do your preservation projects for you. And then certainly nonprofit organizations like us that can help you with advocacy and technical services. So at the federal level, at the national level, we have the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Preservation League of New York State for the state level, and then PBN, we are your local advocacy group. All right, next up is the 4 approaches to the treatment of historic properties. When we talk about doing preservation work in just normal everyday conversations, we often interchangeably use the words preservation, rehabilitation, and reconstruction and restoration. I bought a house, I'm preserving it, I'm rehabbing it, I'm restoring it. And that's fine for everyday conversation. But technically, for preservation planning field, these 4 words relate to 4 different but overlapping approaches for how to treat historic properties. And for each set of these approaches, there is a set of standards and guidelines to articulate what it means to do preservation versus rehabilitation, restoration, or reconstruction. The set of standards is a set of, pretty much for almost all of them, it's 10 standards for each of them. So it's a set of 10 key principles of what it means to do that treatment. And then the guidelines are a common language, kind of easy to read and understand articulation of the recommended courses of actions to apply of how to apply those standards to different parts of your building. So since these 4 treatments were defined by the National Park Service, by the Secretary of the Interior, they have been creating these and issuing these standards and guidelines. The first 2 on the left-hand side are, early ones from the 70s and the 80s. And then on the right-hand side is the current cover of the full book of all of the standards and guidelines for all 4 treatments of historic properties. So let's just kind of quickly go over what each of these 4 treatments mean, the essential ethos of doing each of those treatments. First up is the treatment of preservation. As you see on the screen, it's the act or process of applying measures necessary to sustain the existing form, integrity, and material of a historic property. This focuses on the maintenance and repair. Essentially, when you're applying the treatment of preservation, you're just freezing your building as it is today. You're not making major alterations or changes to the building, the structure, the form, the massing, the materials, even the mechanical elements. You're just doing what you need to maintain that property, to repair what's broken when it gets broken, but you're not dramatically changing anything about it. I think a good example of that is when we talk about municipal buildings. And here's a picture of Buffalo City Hall. It was built as a city hall. It's still being used as a city hall, so we're not changing its original use. The building hasn't been dramatically altered or changed, additions added to it. It's basically the same exact footprint it was since it's been built. While certainly there has been maintenance and repairs on the building as things have broken, but there has not been an overhaul of things like the windows or the mechanicals. It was built without air conditioning. It still doesn't have air conditioning throughout the whole entire building. So again, a great example of just preservation treatment. Another example of the preservation treatment is pretty much most homeowners for most of the years that they own their properties. On average, unless you've, got that chunk of change to be able to do a big, huge project on your house, for the most part, every year we are just doing those general and annual maintenance tasks and simple repairs so we can keep using our house as a house. That is an example of the treatment of preservation. So even if you're not doing a massive restoration, fancy, huge project, by just fixing that broken balustrade on your front porch or broken out step on your stairs, you are applying the treatment of preservation. You are being a preservationist. Our next treatment, and I think the easiest one to understand of all 4 of them, is the treatment of restoration. And so as you see on the screen, it's the act or process of accurately depicting the form, features, and character of a property as it appeared at a particular period of time. And so you would do that by either removing things that were inappropriately added later after that time that you're restoring it to, or needing to reconstruct elements that were missing. The best example of that locally is the Darwin Martin House, and they just finished a humongous multi-year restoration project. Again, bringing that building back to a very specific moment in time. And every time I do this project, this presentation, I never remember to check what year it is that they did it to, but their restoration project brought it back to, I think it was either 1907 or 1911. But whatever the year is, it was literally the last that Frank Lloyd Wright touched it. So it was just the original. Somebody commented, so I'm sure that they have the answer. I think it was 1907. I'm going to believe it. So it's literally the second that Frank Lloyd Wright was done. So it was all of his original designs without any alterations. And so that's what they brought it back to. And so as we all know, living in the region, we know that it had some hard times, or honestly, that the Martin family themselves, after Frank Lloyd Wright finished it, they made some changes, because the Starchitect has his idea of how a building should be, but the people actually living in it need to fix some things to make it more usable. And then once that building got into some hard times, parts of the buildings were part of the building and the greater campus were demolished. New things were added to the building. So this whole restoration project was about restoring it back to that original design. And that, when I emphasize accurately, that's important. The treatment of restoration isn't just saying, oh, it looks historical, it looks like it used to be, or it looks old timey. It's about using the actual documentation from that time to do it using the same design, the same materials, and to mimic that original that original condition and whatnot. So you're going to use photographs from the period. You're going to need those architectural drawings or whatever other materials that you have to help confirm that you are restoring it exactly how it once was. The next thing is the treatment of reconstruction, and very similar to restoration, it's essentially the same thing, but in this instance, the resource is completely gone. It's completely been demolished. It is no longer surviving. And so instead of just starting with whatever's left and fixing it and following the treatment of restoration, with reconstruction, you're building a completely new structure, mimicking that non-surviving structure. So again, the same with reconstruction. It's all about, to correctly follow the treatment of reconstruction, you need photographs, architectural drawings, whatever those actual original documentation is, so that you know that you are actually reconstructing it correctly and not just as an old timey, or it kind of looks like it, or it seems like it's an old building. You actually have to use those resources. The picture that you see here is of the blacksmith shop that was built on campus at the Buffalo Niagara Heritage Village. And to my knowledge is, it might not be a super strict reconstruction project, but they definitely use, information from that time period to help direct how this blacksmith shop would have looked. When I was in grad school, one of my favorite exercises that we did was we had to go to the agricultural library and read a 19th century journal or magazine, one magazine where it picks whatever we wanted to. We had to read a year's worth of issues. And based on what we read in that magazine, we had to describe to the class how to build whatever that building was that was associated with that industry. And so I read a poultry magazine, and then I had to provide the detailed instructions of how to build a 19th century chicken coop. So again, we all kind of know how to make a chicken coop, and the resurgence of having chicken coops in your yard, there's lots of resources on the internet to tell you how to build a chicken coop, but we were reconstructing that structure. So we needed to use actual documentation from that time period of how it would have really have been built then. And our last treatment is the treatment of rehabilitation. And the reason this is the last one, I saved it for last, is that this is the treatment, along with its standards and guidelines, that is used for pretty much 99% of all regulatory aspects associated with historic preservation. So if you have a locally landmarked building and you want to make changes to that building, your preservation commission or board is either going to be using the standards of rehabilitation to evaluate that project, or they're going to be using special design guidelines that they've created that are based on this treatment of rehabilitation. If you are participating in the historic tax credit program, that tax credit application and the proposed work that you want to do is going to be reviewed using these standards of rehabilitation. Why is it the standards, the treatment of rehabilitation that's used in that process? It's because, as you see on the screen, this treatment is the only one that allows for modern changes for continued use while preserving those character defining features. All of the other treatments that we talked about were about freezing that building in a moment in time, either currently or at some point in the past, where rehabilitation is about figuring out the best and most appropriate way to make those alterations for continued use while preserving those features that make it eligible for landmarking in these policies and programs in the first place. Excellent. So here is those 10 standards for rehabilitation. Again, the 10 principles of what it means to do this treatment of rehabilitation. And then on the left-hand side is kind of the cheat sheet, cliff notes of what all this means. Essentially, when you're following the treatment of rehabilitation, you want to retain, repair, and replace in kind. So we want to retain as much of those existing original historic materials as possible. We want to make sure that we are repairing those elements with the least degree of intervention. And if we have to replace them, we want to make sure that it is in kind, that we are matching those original qualities and dimensions and textures, whatever aspects of that thing. We want to make sure that we're replacing it as in kind. We want those new materials to mesh with the architectural makeup of the historic materials. When we talk about that repair aspect of historic materials, we want to make sure that we're repairing things. We want to make sure that our repair methods are the least degree of intervention. A great example of that is sandblasting. You have a masonry structure that has paint on it. Your problem is the paint. You want to remove the paint, so you sandblast it. That solves your problem of the paint. But by removing that paint, you're also removing the top layer of that masonry element, of that brick or that stone. And by removing that top layer of your masonry and the mortar, you're just opening the door for water infiltration. So you might have solved the problem of the paint, but you've created a whole new problem with with moisture infiltration. So again, whatever that method is that we're going to repair, we want it to be of the least degree of intervention possible. And then, as I said before, there's the set of standards, and then there's the guidelines. You can check out the big, huge book that the National Park Service issues. This is the cover of it. They also have, an online version of it that you can explore. And then here is just a page from the standards, from the rehabilitation standards and guidelines, to just show you what the guidelines look like. So it's divided into chapters based on the portions of your building. This is the masonry section. There's going to be wood cladding, exterior cladding section. There's going to be a roof section, a windows and doors section, all aspects of your property. And then they'll give you recommended course of action and not recommended course of action. It's important to understand that these guidelines and the standards themselves are purposefully written to be vague, because every building is different. Every situation and conditions and project plan is different. So it's not necessarily a very strict checklist of you have to do this or you can't do this. It's all about figuring out, well, these are my conditions. This is my building. This is what's recommended, what's not recommended. So how does that apply to my resource? So it's specifically written to be vague so that you can figure out the best path forward for your individual resource. All right, so that is, a bunch of key terms and processes that relate to preservation. Again, any questions or thoughts that you have, pop them in the Q&A or the chat. And next, we're going to go through the different levels of designations and how we evaluate buildings to get listed on whatever level of designation we're talking about. Oh. All right, so first and foremost, these are the four main elements, I guess is a word we could use, that we factor and consider when we're evaluating whether or not a resource is eligible for a designation, whether at the local level or at the national, state, national level. So that's age, criteria, integrity, and significance. Age is separate and is colored differently on purpose. There is a general rule that was established with the creation of the National Register of Historic Places that a resource needed to be at least 50 years old to be eligible. And for many, many years, that was kind of in practice seen as a very hard and fast rule. It has to be 50 years old. And if it's less than 50 years old, we're not even going to look at it or think about it or talk about it. And as time has gone on and the industry has evolved, I think we've come to realize that it's not such a hard and fast rule anymore. The reason that we would have that 50-year requirement is because we need enough time between the construction of that building, between the occurrence of that event that makes it significant, to be able to properly evaluate that resource, right? If it just happened yesterday, how can we possibly evaluate, is it actually significant? It might seem significant now, but in the future, is it going to maintain that level of significance? So, I mean, there's a reasonable, a valid reason to want to make sure that we're having that time to be able to properly identify it. But I also think that we have evolved very significantly as a community, as a society, since the 1960s and 70s when we created these guidelines. I think that we are now a society that is constantly analyzing our events and making connections between things and just overanalyzing every single thing that happens. So I think that we are definitely a society now where we do have an ability to kind of place an event or a resource and evaluate their significance, even if that happened really recently. So when it comes to age, yes, we want to be mindful that we are nominating and considering things that have age to them, but it's not such a hard and fast cutoff at 50 years anymore. So there's a lot more wiggle room with that. Now let's talk about criteria, integrity, and significance. Criteria, pretty straightforward. The textbook, the dictionary definition of it, it's a set of principles or standards used to evaluate properties. So each level of designation that we're going to talk about, whether it's the National Register level or a local landmark level, they will have their own set of criteria that you have to meet to be deemed eligible. So whatever that is, you need to evaluate that and apply it to your property. Integrity, as it says on the screen, relates to the authenticity of a property's historic identity, so that it, whether or not it retains significant, those character defining features and significant aspects of location, design, setting, workmanship, materials, feeling, or association. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more in depth on the next slide. So let's go down to significance next. Significance is easy. It's the who, what, where, when of what makes that resource important, right? But it's not just a rattling of facts and timelines about that site. It's about taking whatever is why that resource is significant and then tying it to the broader historic context. So you have a building. I was thinking about this building earlier today. There's in the middle, in downtown Clarence, there's an old store, a general store that was opened by one of the founding families of Clarence. And of course, the name is escaping me at this moment. I know it starts with an E and John's in the room, so I'm sure he'll type it into the chat momentarily. But that building, had significance to that community because it was, one of the founding families, and that was the store that was, helped create that community. But so their story of significance isn't just tied to just those 5 facts. It also ties to that general pattern of, and that broader historic context of how these communities evolved in a rural environment like the newly settled Western New York. That was, basically from their point of view, from those colonists, a wild frontier. And it fits into this broad pattern of how New York State was developed over time. So it's not just those specific people and times and events of that resource, but how that specific history ties into a broader historic context. All right, so let's talk about integrity. Integrity has been defined by the National Park Service for use in the National Register process, but then has kind of trickled down into all other aspects of it. So now this is the general definition of how we evaluate integrity. So to retain integrity, to have enough integrity to be deemed eligible and for various designation levels, a property must retain significant integrity of at least 4 of these 7 areas. Location, setting, design, materials, workmanship, those are pretty straightforward terms, right? Your location. Is it in the same place it was when it was originally built, or has it been physically moved to a new place? setting. It's a rural homestead that was originally built in the middle of nowhere, but now it's completely up against skyscraper buildings. That's a change in its setting. Design, material, workmanship, again, very straightforward. The elements of its original construction, the original materials, the finer elements of that structure, are those things still there? And then feeling and association are in black and italicized because they're more wiggly kind of things to evaluate. Association relates to, what is that resource associated with? I think the easiest example to illustrate association is, a train station. So you have a train depot that was, it had train tracks in front of it and the building was there. And now we fast forward and there's been a community built up around it and the train is no longer active and those train tracks have been removed. So you have a building that was built for a very specific purpose that no longer has the actual association to its purpose. Those train tracks are either non-functioning or have literally been removed. So that's what association relates to. And feeling is even more wiggly than association, where, you have, for example, a 19th century homestead and it was built, and the feeling of that space when you were there originally was this bucolic scenery and setting, this rural setting. But now it's been, built up around it. Depending on how the community that's built up around it, it could still retain the feeling of that 19th century rural setting, depending on how the neighboring houses, how close they are and how they were planned, or it could have lost that feeling by having the buildings built up right next to it. So again, you need to retain at least 4 of these elements to be deemed as having sufficient integrity. All right, so now let's talk about the different types of designations that exist. For all intents and purposes, there are 3 main ways that you can designate resources. You can list resources to the National Register of Historic Places. That can be individual landmarks, individual resources, or historic districts. Then you can have local level designations. And again, you can designate individual resources or historic districts. And then there is a thing called certified local historic districts. And again, it's only for historic districts, and that's a special type of designation. So let's go through those right now. Pardon me. All right, so the National Register of Historic Places, as we already talked about, it was enabled by the Preservation Act of 1966. It's our federal government's official listing of the sites, districts, structures, objects, the resources that have been deemed worthy of preservation for their historic significance. Vitally important to keep in mind that this is an honorary designation only. Getting listed on the National Register does not impact your private property rights in any way. The only way, you could get listed on the National Register tomorrow, today, and the next day pay someone to tear the building down, and nothing will happen to you so long as you follow your local laws for permitting for demolishing buildings. But the federal government can't do anything to you. There's no teeth, there's no regulatory aspect to this designation level. Where there may come in a regulatory aspect is if, because it's a gateway to financial incentives, if you use your National Register status to either take advantage of historic tax credits or grant programs that are within the state or federal funding opportunities, or you need a permit from the state or federal government to do your project. If you're getting something from the federal government, then yes, they're going to have some things to say about what your project can and cannot do, because they're giving you money to pay for it. They're giving you a permit to be able to do it. So when you partake in those types of programs, then yes, there will be some sort of regulatory aspect to that. But if you're not using their money or their permits, the federal government has nothing to say to you of how you treat your National Register historic listed building. National Register status and the whole process to get deemed eligible and then listed is an important land use tool. I think that we are very familiar with the endless studies that our municipalities do before we make changes to our roadways or to our waterways, our utility infrastructure. But for some reason, when we make significant changes to our built environment, to our buildings, it doesn't come with that same type of investigation. And so even if you don't get listed to the National Register, you don't pursue that, the whole process of researching your property to see if it's eligible or not, it gives you a lot of incredible information for your property. And even if you don't complete the step to get listed to the National Register, you just do the survey work, you get evaluated on whether or not you're even eligible. Because you're in that system, if that Section 106 process gets triggered, there's an adjacent federal action that might impact your property, then it would trigger that Section 106 process. So even if you can't go ahead and actually list it to the National Register, there is still a benefit to starting that process. And then the other key thing to keep in mind when it comes to the National Register of Historic Places is that that owner approval is required. While there is no regulatory aspect to it, it is an action of the federal government, so the property owner needs to approve of that. So if the property in question that you're trying to nominate is owned by a single person, that single property owner needs to give permission. And if it's a historic district, the overwhelming response from those property owners needs to be positive. Next up is local landmarking. You can only designate local landmarks or historic districts if you have a preservation ordinance on the books in your community. So that is that primary law that acts to protect and preserve a community's historic resources. And it is the strongest form of, it's the strongest form of legal protection for historic properties. Each ordinance is going to be tailored to fit the needs of that community. Here in New York State, our SHPO and our Preservation League of New York State did come together and provide a model ordinance that anyone in any community in New York State can use to help create their local preservation ordinance. But your ordinance can say and do whatever you want. It's your law. So when we talk about these preservation ordinances, it's important to understand that, yes, it is an honorary designation. It's a gold star. You are historic and significant, and we value your resource. But it also is regulatory. So once you're landmarked on the local level, any exterior changes to your property will have to be reviewed and approved by your preservation commission or board. So it's that local level designation that comes with that regulatory aspect. Traditionally, local level landmarking is not a gateway to financial incentives. There isn't a blanket program available to give you funding if you're just locally landmarked. But in some communities and some, we at Preservation Buffalo Niagara are an example of this. In some communities, there's municipalities or nonprofit organizations that have created financial incentives or programs that use local landmarking as an eligibility requirement. We have our Historic Home Loan Fund that is opened to low and moderate income homeowners of landmarked properties. But again, that's just based on your community if you have somebody who creates those tools. Just as with National Register status, just going through the process of evaluating a resource to see if it's eligible for local landmarking and doing that survey and research work, it's an important land use tool. It gives you information about your building. Again, we make better decisions about our built environment the more we know about our historic built environment. And then the key thing, lastly, to keep in mind is that owner approval, for the most part, is not required. There are some communities that have that written into their law. Professionally speaking, it's not something that I advise. Local landmark, preservation ordinances are on the same level as any other zoning overlay that might exist. No other zoning overlay requires owner approval. So it seems unnecessary and unnecessary to require that for preservation for landmarking. You got to think of it as the law that's written to protect the buildings because the buildings can't speak for themselves. And instead of with other types of zoning where we're looking at the potential use of the building to, make a determination about that resource, with preservation ordinances, we're using its history to make determinations about that building. And then that last one, the local certified historic district, is kind of a mashup of the two designation levels, right? So it's a local historic district that's been designated following your local law as a local historic district that then has been forwarded to the National Park Service and has been certified by the Secretary of the Interior, effectively, allowing that historic district and the property owners in it to access historic tax credits. Because normally you have to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places to be able to access those tax credits. But by certifying the district, they're not listing you on the National Register, but they're allowing you to access those tax credits. There are two main reasons why a community would pursue a certified local district to get tax credits versus a National Register district. And those two most often reasons, one is for the reason why New York City has so many certified local districts is because of that owner approval that's required for National Register districts. When we talk about New York City, even if it's, a neighborhood in Harlem or out in Queens, that's, a rows of brownstones or, other types of row houses like that. Just the way that the market is in New York City, you could have a 3-story building, with a basement. So you have 4 floors in that building. And if that building's been turned into a condo, you're talking about 4 owners in that one structure. And you're talking about a historic district that has 100, 200, 300 buildings. That's 4 times 300. That's 1,200 owners that need to be notified, that may submit responses and opinions about the historic district. So just the administration of trying to create that National Historic District is a lot. So for New York City, it's a lot easier to create that local district, get it certified, so you get that local level protection, and then you open that door to financial incentives. The other reason why you pursue certified local districts is the reason why we in Buffalo pursue certified local districts. And that's because that district doesn't have the integrity to be eligible for the National Register. It's very historic, and we can articulate that it successfully meets the criteria for being eligible. But because so many of the buildings have either been lost to demolition or altered, the integrity isn't there. So we won't be able to get that district listed on the National Register, but we could get it locally designated, get the protections to stop those demolitions, and then open the door for financial incentives. So again, as you see on the screen, it's honorary and regulatory. It opens the door to specifically tax credits, not grants or other financial incentives that might exist, but just specifically historic tax credits, and also an important land use tool. And because it is a local level landmarking status and just a certification at the federal level, owner approval is not required as part of this process. And then lastly, here is just like a little cheat sheet that shows, the key things that most of us talk about when we're talking about designations, what are the designation and regulation aspects of it. So all of these types of designations are honorary. It's a gold star, your building is significant and worthy of preservation. But it's only with local and certified local that you have that regulatory function. It's only with the National Register and certified locals that you have access to those financial incentives. All of these give you the opportunity to participate in the process. So all of them allow the public to participate. And again, just even more to the point, permit review. It's just if you're locally designated, either regular local district or a certified local, where you would need to get permission based on preservation standards for any exterior changes. All right, that is all of the information about designations. Next, we're going to go through some key benefits to doing historic preservation and following preservation policies. Here is that same Venn diagram from the beginning, showing the fact that historic preservation is inherently sustainable building practice. It's commonly quoted that the greenest building is the one that's already built, and that succinctly expresses the relationship between preservation and sustainability. Because of the name historic preservation, we talk most about preserving the history, preserving the cultural significance of these resources. But it's doing that. It's also preserving our environment and preserving our economy. The repair and retrofitting of existing and historic buildings is, to many in the product of many, many reports and investigations as being kind of the ultimate recycling project, right? And that by focusing on preserving and reusing these buildings has so many other kind of trickle down benefits for the economy, for the environment, as well as socially and culturally, that we're preserving these narratives and stories of our past, but we're also helping environmentally and economically. So let's unpack and kind of talk about some of those aspects. Here on the screen now, you can see is a report that we did in conjunction with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They have a program called Preservation Green Lab, and they came out a good number of years ago to help us analyze our historic properties here in the city. And you can see in that center block there, kind of the major takeaways of their research, showing that our older historic buildings, whether they're designated or not, but our older historic buildings is where we see a greater population density, which is good. A greater population density means that we can provide, there's more need and opportunity for business development and opportunities like that. In our historic buildings, we see more minority-owned and women-owned small businesses, and we see a higher proportion of foreign-born residents. So all of this data that you see on the screen, all of it culminates and kind of gives the message that our historic built environment is the building blocks for inclusive, diverse, economically vibrant communities and cities. That these buildings are providing this, incubator space for all of these communities. And when we lose that, we lose those financially accessible opportunities. I see a question here is asking if this report is publicly available. It is. It should be on our website. I can't tell you right now where on our website it would be. But if you search, Buffalo Preservation Green Lab, it should pop up. But you guys have our email from when you registered, so you can, if you're interested in getting a copy of this, you can certainly shoot us an email and we can provide that for you. A next thing to talk about is, and already kind of talked on, a major benefit of historic preservation is that access to the historic tax credit programs. Here in New York State, there are 2 different programs you can take advantage of. Some people who talk about tax credits like to talk about a state credit versus a federal credit, and I find that to be more confusing to talk that way. It's a lot easier to talk of it as a homeowner credit or your commercial income producing tax credit. For homeowners, permanent residents here in New York State who live in their, owner-occupied homes, you could be eligible for a 20% state historic tax credit. Again, the major eligibility requirement for that program is listing on in the National Register of Historic Places. So again, if you meet all of the eligibility requirements, you could get that 20% state tax credit. It's a tax credit, not a deduction or anything like that. It is a credit on your tax liability. So if you do the program and you end up getting a $10,000 tax credit for your project, that will be applied to your tax liability when you do your taxes, and will wipe away your liability for that year and then roll over until it's used up. On the commercial income producing side, there is a state tax credit of 20%, but also a federal tax credit of 20%. So a combined 40% tax credit. The homeowner credit is just on the state level, so you're only going to be working with SHPO on that tax credit. But for commercial and income producing properties, you're going to be working with both the National Park Service and SHPO, because it's both levels have a tax credit for you. An important thing to keep in mind for this is that recently there were changes on the state level that actually expanded the credit to 30% for projects that spend under $2.5 million. So for all of those kind of regular small scale developer projects, income producing projects, where you're not spending more than $2.5 million, you'll actually get a 50% state combined tax credit, 30% on the state, 20% on the federal level. I have a monthly tax credit workshop where you can learn all about these in more detail. Again, you're more than welcome to reach out to us or check our website for more information about tax credits. Next, and kind of focusing on environmental and economic benefits of preservation, it kind of gets a little muddled and it's a lot of overlapping, so it's not as easy to separate those things out. But this is a great report that was done by Preservation Green Lab from the National Trust. And I know this one, if you keyword search these things, you'll definitely find this on the internet. This was a study they did looking at the nation as a whole. and lots of great information and details in it. The next couple of slides are some key summaries and findings from that report. So this first one, the finding, historic buildings are a valuable existing resource. How do we get to that opinion? So as you see on the screen, a study that was conducted in 2004 reported that if we continue the current national trends of development and demolition, by 2030, we will have demolished and rebuilt nearly 1/3 of our entire building stock. Now, again, as much of a preservationist as I am, I recognize that lives change, missions, needs of our buildings change. And so it is completely reasonable and expected that we are going to have to tear down buildings to build new ones. That's expected. But the level in which, the intensity in which we demolish old buildings for new ones is so intense that we are going to be putting nearly 82 billion square feet of building stock in the garbage. We teach our children from a very young age to collect every stray bottle and piece of paper to recycle that, thinking that that's going to bring us to solve our climate issues, when we're literally throwing away millions of pounds of construction materials without a second thought. Construction and demolition debris constitutes 2/3 of all non-industrial solid waste generation in the United States. The average building demolition yields 155 pounds of waste per square foot. That's a lot. So again, it's, we want to be recycling. We want to conserve our resources and energy. We need to reuse these buildings as much as possible. So it's not just about the actual materials themselves and reusing them and the energy and waste associated with those actual materials. It's also about that embodied energy of that resource. There's a lot of talk these days about carbon footprints and offsetting carbon footprints. When we talk about buildings that we're going to be throwing away, we need to also identify and talk about that embodied energy. It's the measurement of energy used in the process of building that building. So not just the actual act of putting that building together on site, the construction, the gas for the, whatever machinery, whatever it is. It's also the energy that was used to cut those trees down, to turn them into siding, to quarry that stone, to make that cement mix or mortar mix. All of that together is embodied energy. So again, why are we throwing away and wasting all of that energy when we've spent that, we've made that carbon impact in our community? We should be trying to reuse as much of that material so that that carbon added to the environment into the atmosphere isn't done in vain and for waste. I have a fact here in front of me that was that focused on a historic district in Seattle. There's a Pioneer Square historic district, and a study done on that concluded that the embodied energy it would take to tear down the arcade, so all of that lost energy, and then to reconstruct it to the same scale would be equal to almost 1 million gallons of gasoline. So again, it's not just all imaginary things. We need to actually think that all of these things that are before us took actual oil, fossil fuels to build. And when we tear those buildings down, we've wasted that for no reason. It's a little blurry on the bottom of the screen, but you can see how, rehabilitating, retrofitting existing buildings, you save and retain that embodied energy. You're using existing materials. When we talk about new construction, the fact that you've wasted all that energy of the old building and then the energy you've wasted constructing this building and the materials for it, you're putting yourself in a hole already to overcome that negative impact. It's going to take you 42 to 80 years to overcome that negative impact, no matter how energy efficient that building may be, purely because of all the energy that was wasted, that was thrown away. So that is something to be mindful of. Just kind of further illustrating that aspect of this. You have on the right-hand side, the year of carbon equivalency for existing buildings, reuse versus new construction. So again, you can see how, it can take the gray text right there. A study found that it can take anywhere from 10 to 80 years for a new building that is 30% more efficient than the average performing existing building to overcome that negative climate change impacts through its construction process. So here's just like a little chart showing two different temperature zones, so Chicago and Portland, how many years that type of structure would take to recoup the energy use for that. So you have, a single family residence being built in Chicago. Chicago is pretty much on the same level as Buffalo. 38 years, you're in the hole on that energy for having built that building. On the left-hand side is a little graphic I made way back when the buildings at Elmwood and Forest were about to be demolished for the humongous project that is still not done. The amount of energy that was needed to just power the wrecking ball, the demolition crew, just to demolish the building and clear the site, the amount of energy, gasoline it was going to take to power that effort would have powered an electric car around the earth 237 times. Even for an electric car, that's a lot of times driving. The last thing I'll say on this point is that it's important to understand that while we certainly talk about all of these things so much now, that we are in very much crisis mode as it relates to climate change, talking about the environmental aspects of historic preservation is not new. Here is a cover. It's not a sexy, graphic design cover, but it's a cover of a report issued by the ACH, the Advisory Council for Historic Preservation, back in 1979 during the last energy crisis that we had, explaining how conserving historic properties, reusing historic properties can be beneficial to this energy crisis that we're exhibiting. And they went through the methods and examples of how we could do that. So again, this is not new. We've known that preservation is vitally important in this aspect. So it's very much time that we start having the actual construction industry reflect that. It's not just as it relates to kind of the big picture when it comes to energy efficiency in our buildings, but it's also to each individual building material that we have in our historic buildings. And I think the best way to, the best example and best aspect of our building to kind of illustrate that is when it comes to wood windows, original wood windows, and that, wanting to repair and retain those versus ripping them out and replacing them with modern replacement windows. I have highlighted on the bottom of this kind of the most important part of this passage, and that newer replacement windows by comparison last on average 10 to 20 years. And that's the credit to that report that has the actual detailed math for that. Their materials such as glass, vinyl, aluminum are not biodegradable or easily recycled. Wood windows are biodegradable and easily recyclable and easily fixable. In addition, PVC vinyl windows are toxic materials in your home. Just being there, it is incredibly toxic to create those materials. So all in the name of energy efficiency, we're actually making a huger, more negative environmental impact on our building with all of these replacement materials. I get into a lot more detail on this in our Windows 101 class that we do often. And I can certainly give more detailed information if somebody wants to email me for information on it. It is just, no matter which way you do the math, no matter what level of quality or price replacement window you have, study after study after study has shown that if you properly maintain your wood windows and take advantage of the various retrofitting steps that you can do, the weather stripping, using storm windows, all of those things, that you can make an original wood window just as energy efficient as that average middle range window that you would be normally purchasing. Another key thing to keep in mind about, individual aspects of your windows, of your building, keeping the original versus replacing them, and especially for window units, is that original wood windows or original even metal windows are meant and designed to be repaired. If you get a baseball through your window, you can fix that single pane of glass. You don't need to rip out the whole entire thing and fix it. If your lock breaks, you can just fix that lock. If it becomes drafty, you can do things to improve that energy efficiency of that window. But once something goes wrong with your modern replacement window, it is a singular unit. You have to replace that whole entire thing. A story I tell often, and I apologize if you've heard it already, my parents, knowing fully well what I do for a living, having contributed to the student loans that made me who I am today, went and secretly replaced all their windows without telling me on our 1940s Cape house. I came home to visit at one time and saw these horrible windows, went out with my friends to drink away the sorrows. And I came back at night and I realized I did not have a key to my parents' house anymore. And it was quite late, so I could not knock on the door or ring the bell. So me and my drunken Herculean mode went into our carport and just shimmied the brand new replacement window very smoothly up. It just went up right on its own, tumbled into the spare bedroom and went to bed. Woke up the next morning to find that I had completely broken the entire locking mechanism for that window. That window was no longer ever going to lock. There was no way to repair the lock on that window. And so my parents had to buy a whole new frickin' window to replace because I broke a little tiny piece of plastic that was the lock. Again, if that had been a wood window, well, the lock wouldn't have broken, the lock would have stayed still. But the only way I would have been able to get in there was to break my elbow through a pane of glass and unlocked it. And then even then I could just fix that pane of glass. But again, then they had to pay a whole nother $400 for a whole new window. And then the last slide in this and kind of looking at a bigger picture of the economic impact of historic preservation. There's a lot of different ways that we can analyze these numbers, from, a job benefit way, as this fact on the window shows, the economic impact of preservation projects, of construction projects, of rehabilitation projects. But there's also ways that we can analyze the numbers of heritage tourism and that kind of aspect of historic preservation. But no matter which way you kind of look at the numbers, study after study after study from within New York State and across the country has shown that historic preservation has a much more meaningful financial impact and long-lasting impact on communities. Here you can see in that bolded section, the historic rehabilitation has a 32-year track record of creating 2 million jobs and generating $90 billion in private investment. And that studies show that residential rehabilitation especially creates 50% more jobs than new construction. And when we kind of look at the types of jobs and the impact that those jobs have on the broader community, when we're talking about rehabilitation related jobs, those are jobs that require much more training and end up being a much more long-term participation in the local community. You train one person to rehab windows, they can then fix, they can, teach a man to fish. He can, feed himself for life. It's the same kind of analogy there, where when you talk about the jobs that are created as part of new construction, for the most part, on average, those are jobs that require less training, and it's a less of a permanent, improvement to that person's, livelihood. It's a skill that's made for that particular building and not going to maybe create and generate a whole new industry for that individual. Also, when we talk about rehabilitation versus new construction, the general numbers of how that splits is kind of a 60-40 split on material costs and labor costs. So new construction, you're spending 40% on average of your budget on your labor costs, and 60% on, no, I'm sorry, I'm flipping that around. You're spending 60% on your labor costs and about 40% on your materials. But what that 40% that you're spending is, most often you're spending it in other communities. You're buying steel from far away. You're spending glass and replacement materials, window units, whatever, that are made in far away places and shipping them to your place. So even though you're spending a lot on the materials, that investment is going out of your community. Whereas a rehabilitation project, you're going to flip those numbers. So you might be spending less on those materials, but that money is staying in your community. And again, the labor that you're spending on those jobs are more likely to stay in your community than a new construction, where those job crews kind of travel from new construction project to new construction project and don't necessarily stay permanently in that community. Another thing I'll say, last thing I'll say about the economic impact of historic preservation is that we are right now in the middle of doing an economic impact study for the city of Buffalo, analyzing how historic preservation has financially benefited the city of Buffalo. We have partnered with a couple of other organizations in town and raised the money to hire Place Economics. It's a firm, pretty much the only firm in the country, the number one firm in the country to do these types of reports. And so they came for their site visits. They're pulling their data right now. We hope to have the final report ready for the public, I think at the end of summer or in the fall. So keep your eyes on our email list and on the media, because we're definitely going to make a lot of hubbub when that report is done and completed to show, with facts and figures and charts and graphs, how much historic preservation has benefited the city of Buffalo. While those numbers will just look at the city, it certainly will apply to our neighboring communities and show what potential other communities could have if they incorporated more preservation into their work. And with that, this presentation is an end. That is everything I have for you as far as Preservation 101. It is a lot of information. But thank you so much for going on this preservation journey with me. If anyone has any questions, please, again, put them into the chat or the Q&A box. I'm here to answer those. I don't see any right now, so I will say thank you so much for joining us. Head over to our website. We have some events coming up later this summer, some walking tours and other lectures and workshops. So we'd love to see you attend those as well. But thank you so much for being here. I will leave the room open for another moment or so in case someone is typing out a question that I can answer for them. But otherwise, have a great rest of your evening. Good night.